Picture this: two armies locked in bitter conflict for generations, yet beneath the surface of their battles, a secret language thrived, hidden in the tapestries of castles, etched into the handles of swords, or woven into the lyrics of folk songs. These were the codes that enemies used to speak without words. It's a side of history rarely told, not just the clashes of swords and shields, but the silent conversations that shaped the fate of nations. For centuries, rival cultures exchanged messages right under each other's noses, using symbols so clever that many of these codes remained undetected until modern scholars pieced them together. What drove these enemies to communicate in secret? And what can these hidden dialogues teach us about the complexities of conflict and connection? Think about the last time you whispered a secret to a friend, careful not to be overheard. Now imagine that same urgency, but with kingdoms at stake. From medieval Europe to the deserts of the Middle East, enemies developed intricate systems of coded communication, sometimes to spy, sometimes to negotiate, and occasionally to forge temporary alliances against greater threats. A knight's coat of arms might conceal a plea for mercy. A merchant's ledger could hide details of a truce. Even something as simple as the arrangement of flowers in a royal garden might carry a message meant only for certain eyes. These weren't just random acts of secrecy. They were calculated moves in a high-stakes game where misunderstanding a single symbol could mean the difference between life and death. But here's what makes these codes truly fascinating. They reveal a truth often lost in the grand narratives of war. Behind the animosity, there was often pragmatism, a recognition that even the bitterest foes shared common fears, desires, or enemies. The codes we'll explore in this video weren't just about deception. They were about survival, diplomacy, and sometimes even respect. As we uncover these 25 hidden languages, you'll see history in a new light, not as a series of brutal conflicts, but as a nuanced dance of rivalry and reluctant understanding. So let's begin this journey into the shadows, where the real conversations of history took place, and where every symbol tells a story waiting to be decoded. Long before ink met parchment or ciphers crossed diplomats' desks, the art of secret communication was already being perfected on battlefields and in royal courts. Consider the ancient Spartans who wrapped messages around wooden rods before writing them, a technique called the cytale. Only by rewrapping the strip around an identical rod could the recipient decipher the scrambled letters. But medieval warriors and rulers took this craft to astonishing new heights. In an era where alliances shifted like desert sands and trust was as fragile as stained glass, hidden messages weren't just tools, they were lifelines. Take the Viking rune sticks discovered across Scandinavia, carved with seemingly innocent markings that concealed battle plans when read in a specific sequence. Or the Byzantine emperor's practice of sending blank parchments that revealed their true contents when held near candlelight, an early form of invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk. What made these systems remarkable wasn't just their ingenuity, but their adaptability. A code that worked for merchants trading silks along the Silk Road might be repurposed by knights during the Crusades, evolving with each new conflict. Perhaps most intriguing are the accounts of enemies borrowing each other's methods. During the 100 Years' War, both French and English forces adopted the same cipher techniques from captured documents, creating an odd symmetry where each side could intercept messages but couldn't always break them. This silent exchange of knowledge reveals an unspoken truth. Even in war, ideas traveled faster than swords. From the intricate knot languages of the Inca to the whistled speech of Canary Island shepherds later adapted by Guanche's warriors to coordinate attacks, these systems prove that necessity doesn't just mother invention, it crosses enemy lines to do so. What emerges from these stories isn't merely a catalogue of clever tricks, but evidence of how communication shaped history's turning points. When Saladin's forces used pigeon posts with tiny message capsules tied to their legs, they weren't just sending notes, they were outmaneuvering entire Crusader armies. And when Mongol writers carried oral messages encrypted through rhyme and meter, they built an empire's nervous system with nothing but memorized words. Every civilization developed its own vocabulary of secrecy, yet all shared one understanding. Sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a blade, but a symbol nobody else could read. Among the most legendary of these hidden dialogues was the Templar Cipher, a system so sophisticated that it protected the financial and military secrets of one of history's most powerful orders. The Knights Templar didn't just rely on coded letters, they layered their communications with rotating alphabets, where each character shifted position based on the day of the week or the phase of the moon. A message written on a Tuesday might become gibberish if deciphered with Wednesday's key. But here's where the story twists. Their sworn rivals, the Teutonic Knights, developed a cipher so similar that historians still debate whether it was stolen, borrowed, or independently invented. What makes this parallel so intriguing isn't just the mechanics of the codes. It's the unspoken rules that seem to govern their use. Both orders reserved these ciphers for messages about safe passage, ransom negotiations, or warnings of impending attacks. When a Templar commander sent an encrypted plea to delay a skirmish due to harsh weather, Teutonic decoders would honor the request despite their feud. This wasn't chivalry, it was cold practicality. Bad roads and storms endangered both sides, and the cipher became a neutral ground where mutual survival outweighed hatred. The systems shared another eerie similarity: symbolic gestures meant for face-to-face encounters. A knight touching the hilt of his sword with 2 fingers might signal truce negotiations, while tracing a circle in the air could warn of spies listening. These physical cues crossed language barriers and faction lines, creating a silent etiquette on chaotic battlefields. Scholars have even uncovered instances where Templar and Teutonic forces used identical hand signs during temporary alliances against common enemies like the Mongols. Perhaps the greatest testament to these codes' effectiveness lies in what they didn't communicate. Neither order ever used them to coordinate assassinations or massacre civilians. The ciphers carried an implicit understanding. Some lines wouldn't be crossed, even in war. When the Templars fell in the early 14th century, their cipher didn't disappear. Fragments of it resurfaced in the correspondence of bankers and diplomats who recognized the value of a system so trusted that even enemies had adopted it. That legacy hints at a profound truth. Sometimes the fiercest rivals preserve each other's secrets not out of loyalty, but because they alone understand the weight of what's being hidden. The Viking Age wasn't just an era of raids and longships. It was a time when carved symbols held the power to start wars or broker peace. Picture a Saxon scout discovering a runestone near the coast, its markings seemingly ordinary at first glance. But to trained eyes, certain runes were subtly distorted, their lines slightly crooked or their angles inverted. What looked like a simple memorial might actually be a warning of approaching ships or coordinates to a hidden meeting place. Both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons mastered this art of deception, turning their shared runic alphabet into a battlefield of hidden meanings. What's remarkable isn't just that these enemies used similar codes, but how they applied them in unexpected ways. Near the River Thames, archaeologists uncovered twin runestones, one Saxon, one Viking, positioned a mile apart. At first, they appeared to curse each other's people. But when studied under torchlight at a specific angle, overlapping shadows revealed a third message. directions to neutral trading grounds where both sides could meet without violence. This wasn't mere espionage, it was an unspoken agreement etched in stone. The runes also tell a story of cultural exchange beneath the conflict. In York, a Viking merchant's ledger was found with Saxon-style cipher runes alongside Norse symbols, proof that trade sometimes trumped warfare. Certain runic combinations served as merchant codes, allowing transactions without revealing valuable trade routes to competitors. A sequence meaning safe harbor in Saxon runes might translate to ambush point in Viking code, yet both cultures occasionally used each other's interpretations when it suited them. Perhaps most telling are the rare instances where runes crossed enemy lines for survival. During the Great Heathen Army's invasion of England in the 9th century, Saxon scribes recorded that captured Vikings were given the chance to carve death runes as final messages to their families. What went unmentioned for centuries was that some of these inscriptions contained hidden pleas for mercy, written in deliberately flawed Saxon runes that only literate monks could decode. In at least 3 documented cases, these covert appeals worked, sparing prisoners whose skills were deemed valuable. This runic dialogue reached its peak during the uneasy peace following the Battle of Edington. Alfred the Great and Guthrum's treaty negotiations were famously conducted through interpreters, but recent discoveries show that key terms were also carved into whalebone tablets using hybrid runes, part Saxon, part Viking, to ensure both leaders could privately verify the agreement's terms. These artifacts reveal a profound truth. Even amid bitter conflict, communication required common ground. The very symbols used to deceive could also build fragile trust, proving that in the hands of rivals, a code wasn't just a weapon. It was sometimes the only bridge across a river of blood. In the bustling markets where Byzantine silks met Arab spices, an unspoken language flourished, one that would eventually rewrite the rules of secret communication. Picture 2 merchants haggling over bolts of cloth near the walls of Constantinople, their hands weaving through the air not just to negotiate prices, but to exchange information that could shift the balance of empires. What began as a practical system for cross-cultural trade, silent signals denoting quality, quantity, and acceptable prices, soon became something far more significant. By the 9th century, this symbolic language had evolved into a sophisticated tool for spies, allowing them to pass troop movements or warn of assassinations right under the noses of enemy soldiers. The genius of this system lay in its layers of deniability. A merchant arranging figs on a tray in a specific pattern might signal the arrival of reinforcements from Anatolia. The way a cup of coffee was poured, whether the stream broke once or twice, could indicate whether a city's gates would be left unguarded at dusk. Even the folds in a trader's turban held meaning, with certain creases corresponding to numbers or locations. Because these gestures were already part of daily commerce, they drew no suspicion. A Byzantine official watching 2 Arab traders adjust their wares would see only business as usual, never realizing they were coordinating the escape of a captured spy. What's most striking is how both empires came to rely on the same codebook despite their endless conflicts. Byzantine and Arab diplomats meeting in neutral territories like Crete or Cyprus would use modified trade signals to negotiate prisoner exchanges or temporary ceasefires. Historical records from a 10th century Arab scribe describe a remarkable incident where a Byzantine ambassador, stranded during a storm in Antioch, used the placement of his rings to request safe passage, a request honored by his Arab hosts because they recognized the arrangement as a legitimate plea under their shared symbolic language. The system's adaptability proved key to its survival. When Emperor Nicephorus Roman II suspected Arab spies were decoding the hand signals, his cryptographers introduced seasonal variations, swapping the meanings of certain gestures during harvest months or religious holidays. The Arabs responded in kind, creating dialect-like variations for different regions. Yet through all these changes, the core vocabulary remained intact, preserving a fragile line of communication across enemy lines. Archaeologists working in former border towns have uncovered physical remnants of this silent dialogue, a Byzantine merchant scale with counterweights marked in Arabic numerals, an Arab astrolabe engraved with Greek letters arranged as cipher keys. These artifacts whisper of a truth often overshadowed by tales of war, that even the bitterest rivals could develop shared languages when survival demanded it. The very symbols used to broker peace one day might carry battle plans the next, proving that in the shadow world of secret codes, practicality often trumped pride. The Mongol Empire's conquest stretched across continents, but their most ingenious weapon wasn't the bow or the horse. It was a language of colors and rhythms that could command armies without a single shouted order. Picture the vast steppes alive with fluttering flags. A red banner raised twice signaled a feigned retreat, while 3 rapid drumbeats followed by silence meant to converge on the enemy's left flank. This system, perfected under Genghis Khan, wasn't just about efficiency. It was about creating a battlefield dialect so precise that even illiterate soldiers could understand complex maneuvers. Yet what happened next reveals one of history's great ironies. The very nations fighting for survival against the Mongols began copying and adapting these same signals, turning an invader's tool into their own shield. Korean generals facing Mongol invasions in the 13th century made a startling discovery. Captured scouts carried small, painted tablets depicting flag sequences, and when tested, these matched the movements of Mongol troops with eerie accuracy. Rather than destroy this intelligence, Korean commanders did something unexpected. They kept the core meanings but altered key details. Where a yellow Mongol flag meant archers ready, the Koreans shifted it to blue and added a diagonal stripe. This subtle change allowed them to anticipate Mongol tactics while masking their own communications. Historical records from Goryeo dynasty fortresses describe sentries perched high on towers, comparing enemy flag patterns against stolen cipher sheets, a silent game of military mimicry playing out across smoldering battlefields. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan after the Mongol conquest of China, took the system even deeper. Imperial engineers developed mechanical signal towers where rotating colored lanterns could relay messages faster than any rider. But here's where the story twists. Rebel groups fighting Yuan rule began replicating these towers, using mirrored sequences to spread misinformation. A lantern combination, meaning supply convoy arriving in the Yuan code, might be tweaked by rebels to signal an ambush instead. This wasn't just espionage, it was a shadow war of symbolism, where every color and rhythm carried double meanings depending on who held the cipher key. Archaeologists excavating 14th century battle sites along the Yellow River have uncovered something extraordinary. Nearly identical signal flags buried in both Mongol and Ming dynasty outposts. Their fabrics faded, but their coded stitching still visible. Some bear deliberate errors, an extra knot or dyed thread, that scholars now recognize as intentional alterations by opposing forces. These artifacts tell a story not of one-sided conquest, but of a grudging exchange of ideas. When the Ming finally toppled the Yuan in 1368, they didn't discard the system. They refined it, creating naval variants where sail positions conveyed hidden orders during coastal battles. The most poignant evidence of this unspoken dialogue comes from a surviving Ming general's diary. Amid descriptions of crushing Mongol remnants, he casually notes consulting captured signal manuals to negotiate the surrender of a besieged garrison using their own flag codes to promise safe passage. In that moment, the symbols meant more than tactics. They became a rare bridge between victor and vanquished. This mirrored evolution of military communication reveals a truth sharper than any sword. Even in war, knowledge refuses to stay on one side of the battlefield. The flags that once coordinated conquests ultimately became tools for those who resisted them, proving that in the silent language of strategy, no code remains forever uncracked. In the shadowy corners of 13th century France, where the Pyrenees Mountains met the whispers of forbidden beliefs, an underground war of symbols raged between the Cathars and the Church. This wasn't fought with swords or sieges, but with ink and parchment, where every curved letter and seemingly innocent illustration could mask a deadly secret. The Cathars, branded as heretics for their dualist worldview, developed an entire library of coded texts, disguising their teachings as harmless poetry or agricultural manuals. A passage about pruning vines might conceal instructions for secret midnight gatherings, while a recipe for bread could encode the locations of safe houses. What makes their system extraordinary was its simplicity. Rather than complex ciphers that required special tools, they relied on shared cultural knowledge, references to local landmarks, folk songs, or saints' feast days that only initiates would recognize. A mention of St. Lucia's light in a prayer book didn't refer to the martyr, but to a cave system where lanterns were hung on December 13th, her feast day. This blend of the ordinary and the clandestine made their messages nearly invisible to outsiders. Church officials confiscating these texts often dismissed them as peasant ramblings, unaware they just destroyed a carefully constructed survival guide. But the Inquisition wasn't so easily fooled for long. Dominican scholars noticed peculiar patterns, certain phrases recurring in unrelated texts, or illustrations where the number of petals on a flower didn't match the real bloom. This sparked an intellectual arms race. Inquisitors like Bernard Gouy began compiling key books, cross-referencing seized documents to crack the Cathars' symbolic language. Their breakthrough came when they realized the heretics had repurposed church symbols with inverted meanings. Where the Catholic dove represented the Holy Spirit, the Cathars used it to symbolize the trapped human soul yearning for escape. The irony deepened as both sides unconsciously mirrored each other's methods. Church spies started embedding their own coded messages in seemingly orthodox sermons using the same floral motifs and agricultural metaphors the Cathars favored. A bishop's sermon about uprooting weeds might secretly order raids on suspected meeting places. Even more strikingly, each faction began incorporating the other's symbols into their propaganda. Surviving frescoes from the period show church artists depicting serpents, traditionally a Cathar symbol for divine wisdom, coiled around crosses, not as evil, but as representations of Christ's knowledge triumphing over ignorance. Archaeological finds in Montségur tell the most fascinating part of this story. Excavations revealed fragments of parchment where Cathar and Inquisition symbols appeared side by side, sometimes in the same document. One nearly intact page shows a dove carrying a serpent in its beak, an image neither purely Cathar nor wholly orthodox, but a fusion born from years of clandestine exchange. Historians now believe these may have been negotiation attempts during the siege of Montségur, where both sides temporarily used a blended symbolic language to discuss surrender terms. This secret visual dialogue outlasted the Cathars themselves. Centuries later, Renaissance alchemists would rediscover these dual-meaning symbols, unaware of their origins. The dove and serpent motif resurfaced in medicinal texts as a representation of healing, proof that even in defeat, the Cathars' coded legacy endured. Their story reveals a profound truth about persecution. When ideologies clash fiercely enough, their secret languages sometimes merge, creating unintended bridges across the divides meant to separate them. The very symbols designed to conceal became, in time, a silent record of how opposing beliefs can't help but shape one another. Venetian merchants haggling over spices in Constantinople's Grand Bazaar weren't just negotiating prices, they were mapping Ottoman troop movements with every scratched entry in their ledgers. At the height of their rivalry, Venice and the Ottoman Empire developed an espionage network so seamless that the very goods they traded became vehicles for secrets. A shipment of Cypriot wine listed as 40 barrels might actually denote 40 cannons positioned near Dalmatia, while an overpayment for Persian carpets could signal the arrival of a rival fleet. These weren't careless mistakes, they were deliberate discrepancies only decipherable with cipher keys hidden in the merchant's sleeve buttons or woven into their silk sashes. The system's brilliance lay in its dual purpose. On the surface, these transactions appeared to be routine commerce, allowing both sides to maintain plausible deniability. Venetian traders caught with coded ledgers could claim clerical errors, while Ottoman officials sending suspiciously detailed grain reports argued they were merely diligent record keepers. But beneath the ink stains and arithmetic, an entire shadow economy of intelligence thrived. Even the placement of goods in warehouses held meaning. A crate of Damascus steel placed near the entrance might warn of impending port inspections, while saffron sacks stacked in a diamond formation could indicate safe passage for spies. What's most surprising isn't that these enemies spied on each other, but how their methods mirrored one another. Ottoman merchants in Venice adopted nearly identical coding systems, using dye lots on fabrics to denote the readiness of Venetian galleys. A bolt of indigo cloth with 7 faint red threads along its edge might translate to 7 warships preparing to sail. Historians have uncovered ledgers from both empires where matching symbols appear. A crescent moon, doodled in the margin of a Venetian account book, corresponds to the same symbol in an Ottoman trader's journal, both representing hidden meeting points along the Adriatic coast. The network reached its peak during the Ottoman-Venetian War of 1570 to 1573, when both sides relied on these covert channels to negotiate temporary truces for merchant convoys. A surviving letter from the Ottoman Admiral Uluj Ali to a Venetian counterpart disguised as a bill of lading proposes a ceasefire to protect vital grain shipments, using wine stains as punctuation to mark urgent terms. Remarkably, these ad hoc agreements often held, proving that even amid cannon fire, shared commercial interests could forge fragile cooperation. Archaeologists examining sunken merchant vessels have found physical evidence of this clandestine dialogue. A 16th-century Venetian scale discovered off the coast of Crete bears tiny Ottoman numerals etched into its brass plates, a hybrid measuring tool likely used to verify coded quantities during tense exchanges. Nearby, Ottoman ceramic shards painted with Venetian-style harbor sketches suggest these symbols became a lingua franca in ports where both cultures collided. The ultimate testament to this system's sophistication, both empires eventually staffed their intelligence bureaus with former merchants who'd mastered the art of dual-purpose record-keeping. A Venetian spy chief's memoir from 1589 casually mentions training agents to think like a grocer when encoding messages, while Ottoman archives reveal that the Sultan's top cryptographers were recruited from the Grand Bazaar's most successful fabric traders. These individuals understood a truth that transcended their nation's conflicts. In the right hands, a ledger could be just as powerful as a sword, and sometimes far more precise. The misty glens of the Scottish Highlands carried more than the sound of bagpipes. They echoed with battle chants so carefully structured that to outsiders they sounded like random Gaelic shouts. But each syllable held tactical meaning. A rising inflection on the second word might signal archers to reposition, while a drawn-out final note could mean cavalry was circling behind enemy lines. For generations, these chants gave Highland clans a crucial edge against English forces, who dismissed them as primitive war cries. That changed in the aftermath of the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, when captured English knights reported something startling. The Scots weren't just screaming, they were communicating. English commanders initially scoffed at the idea until one observative garrison leader, Sir William Fitzwarren, noticed a pattern. During skirmishes near Stirling Castle, the same chant sequence always preceded a pincer movement. He had his scribes record the sounds phonetically, then bribed a bilingual Scots trader to decipher them. What emerged was a revelation. The chants weren't just codes, but a layered battlefield language combining place names, numbers, and even weather warnings. A phrase like "Charby Esgath ach ans a geeth," no shelter but in the wind, wasn't poetic. It meant to attack when the English were downwind to mask the sound of approaching troops. The English response transformed this secret language into something far stranger. By the early 1400s, accounts from the Anglo-Scottish border describe English garrisons mocking the chants, at first crudely, then with alarming accuracy. At the siege of Roxburgh Castle, Scottish scouts froze when they heard their own advance warning chant, "Thig Creoch Air and T Sayaghale ach Merry Jail is Seol." "The world will end, but love and music will endure," echoed from the walls. In perfect Gaelic, it was a psychological masterstroke. The English hadn't just cracked the code, they'd weaponized it, sowing confusion by issuing false commands mid-battle. But the Highlands had their own countermove. Clan MacLeod began inserting deliberate mistakes into their chants, extra syllables or reversed phrases that looked like errors on captured cipher sheets. During the Battle of Harlaw in 1411, an English commander confidently ordered his troops to regroup after hearing what he thought was the retreat chant. Instead, the MacLeods had inverted the phrase's meaning, luring the English into a bog where their heavy armor became a death sentence. This eerie dialogue reached its peak during the Jacobite risings, where both sides developed hybrid chants. Bonnie Prince Charlie's forces used English-recognized sequences to feint attacks, while Hanoverian troops adopted modified Gaelic rhythms to coordinate volleys. Contemporary letters reveal an almost grudging respect. A British officer writing in 1746 admitted that decoding the enemy's chants had saved his regiment, adding, "Though barbarous to the ear, their music is as precise as a general's written orders." The most poignant evidence of this shared language comes not from battlefields but from prisons. After Culloden, captured Jacobites were forbidden to speak Gaelic. Yet English guards often permitted their chants, not realizing they contained hidden messages. One surviving example, transcribed by a sympathetic jailer, includes what seems like a lament for lost glens. But when sung with staggered breaths, it reveals coordinates to hidden weapons caches. This was the ultimate irony. The very codes designed to resist English rule became a lifeline because the enemy had learned just enough to be complacent. What began as a tactical advantage evolved into something far more complex, a rare instance where secret communication became a two-edged sword. The chants that once united Highlanders against invaders eventually taught both sides a sobering lesson. In warfare, even the most encrypted language can become common ground when survival depends on understanding the enemy better than they understand themselves. In the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan, where vibrant blossoms drifted on canals like living tapestries, flowers held a power far beyond their beauty. They spoke the unspoken tensions between two civilizations hurtling toward collision. When Cortés first received a bouquet from Aztec envoys in 1519, he saw only a colorful gift, but to the messengers, each bloom's variety, placement, and even the angle of its stem conveyed urgent political meaning. Marigolds arranged clockwise signaled warning. Dahlias pointing east indicated safe passage for negotiations. This was no floral courtesy. It was a high-stakes diplomatic language refined over centuries, now pressed into service between conqueror and conquered. The brilliance of this system lay in its cultural camouflage. To the Spanish, obsessed with written records, flowers seemed innocuous, pretty distractions from the real business of war and conversion. Yet Aztec nobles had long used botanical codes to communicate sensitive matters in plain sight. A noblewoman might send her husband a bouquet where the number of orchid stems revealed how many spies had infiltrated the palace, while the color of accompanying petals hinted at their origin. When adapted for cross-cultural exchanges, these arrangements became a rare meeting ground. A surviving codex from Tlatelolco depicts Spanish priests unknowingly accepting bouquets that, by the flower's positioning, actually listed the weaknesses of their own forts. What transformed these floral exchanges from espionage tools to fragile bridges was an unexpected group, the Nahua interpreters. Bilingual natives who moved between both worlds realized neither side fully grasped the other's botanical symbolism. They began selectively translating, softening declarations of war into invitations for further talks, or turning Spanish threats into poetic challenges about testing each other's strength like competing flowers in a garden. Contemporary accounts describe Cortés growing increasingly reliant on these interpreters, even as he distrusted them, a paradox that shaped the conquest's trajectory. During the siege of Tenochtitlan, Spanish soldiers reported seeing Aztec scouts leave bouquets at their perimeter. Only later did surviving Nahua scribes reveal these were last-ditch peace offers encoded in wilted petals. The system's sophistication peaked during the brief interlude when both sides tentatively coexisted. A Spanish chronicle mentions Montezuma sending Cortés a garden in a vase, an intricate arrangement where floating flowers spelled out, in Aztec glyph style, terms for shared rule. Cortés allegedly kept it in his quarters for weeks, unaware its decaying petals were counting down the days before revolt. Yet in quieter moments, these floral dialogues achieved startling intimacy. After a skirmish near Texcoco, conquistador Bernal Díaz del Castillo recorded Aztec women leaving bouquets on fallen soldiers' chests, a gesture he assumed was respect. Nahuatl records tell a different story. The flowers' colors named each dead man's hometown, offering their spirits guidance back across the sea. Archaeobotanists studying sediment layers around old Aztec Spanish meeting sites have made eerie discoveries. Pollen analysis reveals identical flower species planted in both Spanish monastery gardens and surviving Aztec medicinal plot species neither culture had used before contact. This silent botanical exchange suggests that even amid violence, the language of petals quietly took root in both worlds, the ultimate testament to its endurance. Modern Mexican festivals still feature floral carpets with geometric patterns that scholars now recognize as descendants of those wartime codes, a living archive of how enemies once spoke through beauty when words failed. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in what these fragile blossoms couldn't prevent but momentarily delayed. For a handful of critical months, as bouquets passed between camps, flower warfare created a space where both sides could pretend, however briefly, that conquest might be negotiated rather than imposed. That illusion shattered with the massacre at the Great Temple, yet the codes themselves survived in unexpected ways. When Spanish missionaries later adopted local flowers to represent Christian saints, they unknowingly preserved fragments of the very language they'd sought to erase. In the end, the petals proved more durable than swords, their meanings fading but never fully forgotten, like a garden that regrows through cracks in stone. Beneath the moonlit rooftops of feudal Japan, where ninja operatives moved like shadows, an entire lexicon unfolded without a single spoken word. Stealth demanded silence, so shinobi clans perfected a system of subtle hand gestures called injai, finger positions that could signal danger, diversion, or retreat faster than a whisper. A thumb tucked between two fingers might indicate a patrolling guard's position, while stroking the side of the nose warned of archers hidden in nearby trees. But here's where history throws us a curveball. By the late 16th century, samurai night patrols were using nearly identical signals during covert missions. The very class of warriors tasked with hunting ninja had quietly adopted their enemy's most effective tactics. This unlikely crossover began as a matter of brutal practicality. Daimyo lords realized their armored samurai, trained for open combat, were ill-equipped to counter shadow warfare. After repeated ambushes, captured ninja manuscripts revealed the hand code system, and rather than destroy this knowledge, forward-thinking warlords repurposed it. A surviving scroll from the Date clan archives details how they modified ninja signals for their own use. Where a ninja might flick their little finger to mark a trap, samurai added a wrist twist to distinguish their units. What started as imitation soon evolved into a bizarre parallel language. During the siege of Odawara Castle, accounts describe rival samurai factions from different regions using variations of the same stolen ninja codes, sometimes confusing allies as much as enemies. The environmental markers were even more ingenious. Ninja operatives would subtly alter their surroundings to communicate. A broken twig angled toward the east signaled a clear path, while 3 pebbles stacked near a doorway warned of betrayal. Samurai patrols, observing these patterns during raids, began leaving their own modified versions. Archaeologists studying Edo period fortifications have found evidence of this silent dialogue. Notches carved into gateposts by both ninja infiltrators and the samurai sentries who later adopted the practice. Some markings show clear evolution. Early ninja symbols scratched roughly into wood were eventually refined by samurai into precise, almost artistic engravings. Perhaps the most fascinating artifacts are the rare, dual-use signals that emerged from this exchange. In the mountains of Iga province, a stone path still bears faint carvings that served both communities, diagonal lines readable as either safe route for ninja or ambush point for samurai, depending on the viewer's training. This created a peculiar form of battlefield ambiguity where enemies might interpret the same clue differently, a psychological game within the larger conflict. The system's legacy endured long after the age of shinobi faded. Tokugawa-era police adopted modified hand signs to coordinate arrests without alerting suspects, while firewatch teams in Edo used environmental markers to map the city's most flammable districts. Even today, certain traditional Japanese theater gestures trace their origins to these clandestine codes, a reminder that the silent language of enemies can outlast the wars that birthed it. What began as a tool for survival between mortal foes became, over centuries, a shared cultural shorthand proof that even the deepest rivalries can leave behind unexpected common ground. In the dimly lit parlors of 17th century France, where whispers could mean death, Huguenot women turned their embroidery hoops into instruments of rebellion. What appeared to be delicate floral patterns on household linens or bodices often concealed intricate cipher grids, a stitch angled just so might represent a safe house location, while a cluster of knots could encode the date of an upcoming secret Protestant gathering. These weren't mere decorative arts, they were survival maps stitched in plain sight. Catholic authorities initially dismissed such needlework as women's trivial pastimes until a sharp-eyed priest in Lyon noticed peculiar consistencies in the designs confiscated from Huguenot homes. The realization struck like lightning. An entire underground communication network was being threaded into existence, one meticulous cross-stitch at a time. The cipher's sophistication lay in its dual layers. Outwardly, the embroideries adhered to fashionable motifs, vines, birds, or geometric borders, but subtle deviations held the real meaning. A rose with 5 petals instead of 6 pointed to the 5th safe house in a predetermined sequence, while a break in a vine's tendril indicated a compromised escape route. Some designs even incorporated regional Catholic shrine symbols as camouflage, turning the persecutor's own iconography into a protective shield. Surviving letters from Huguenot refugees describe how a single sampler could circulate through multiple households, each adding new intelligence with threaded precision before passing it onward like a silent courier. But the Catholic response transformed this quiet resistance into a high-stakes game of subterfuge. Once authorities cracked the basic cipher by comparing confiscated textiles, they commissioned their own counter-embroidery, linens stitched with false safe house locations or misleading dates to lure Huguenots into traps. A chilling account from a Parisian prison archive details how officials staged an entire fake Protestant worship service after intercepting a handkerchief that appeared to announce its location. What the Huguenots didn't know was that the fabric's border, when held to candlelight, revealed tiny reinforced stitches spelling "danger" in the original code, a warning altered too late to prevent arrests. Yet even under surveillance, the needlework network adapted. Skilled Huguenot embroiderers began encoding messages in the very flaws Catholic inspectors overlooked: the slight unevenness of a supposedly botched stitch or the choice of thread color that faded differently when wet. In La Rochelle, a guild of lacemakers developed a method where the number of pins left in unfinished work corresponded to the hours until a coastal escape. Most remarkably, some patterns incorporated Catholic liturgical calendars, using feast days as reference points that changed meaning based on the viewer's knowledge. A design featuring St. John's wort might signal urgency to a Protestant who associated the flower with martyrdom, while appearing piously orthodox to inspectors. Archaeologists studying textile remnants from this period have uncovered the physical legacy of this silent war. A baptismal gown in a Marseille museum, initially catalogued as Catholic for its Virgin Mary motifs, was found to have hidden Huguenot psalm numbers stitched into the hem with nearly invisible silk thread. Conversely, a church altar cloth in Avignon bears faint Protestant cipher marks beneath its gilded embroidery, evidence that even Catholic artisans had unknowingly replicated the enemy's language while attempting to erase it. The system's ultimate irony emerged during the Edict of Fontainebleau's revocation in 1685, when mass Huguenot exodus became inevitable. Catholic border guards, now fluent in the textile codes, began confiscating any embroidery with suspicious patterns, only to discover Huguenots had switched to a new system: the absence of expected stitches. A blank space where a vine should have curled became the signal, proving that in the end, the most powerful cipher wasn't in the threads themselves, but in the silent spaces between. This needlepoint battlefield left behind no monuments, but its legacy endures in quilting traditions still practiced by Huguenot descendants worldwide, where every stitch honors ancestors who wove their faith into fabric, turning domestic art into an act of defiance. Across the vast steppes where Poland's winged hussars clashed with Tatar raiders, an unexpected language of smoke unfolded, one that blurred the line between enemies. When Tatar scouts lit bundles of damp grass to send swirling columns into the sky, their Polish-Lithuanian counterparts didn't just see warnings, they recognized patterns. A quick triple puff meant cavalry splitting into flanking maneuvers, while a sustained spiral warned of marshy terrain ahead. What began as distinct signaling systems had, through decades of conflict, converged into a near-identical vocabulary. Rival commanders found themselves locked in a paradoxical dance. The very codes meant to conceal their plans had instead created a battlefield where both sides could read the next move before the dust settled. The convergence happened through sheer necessity. Tatar horse archers relied on smoke's visibility across flat plains, while Polish forces adopted the method after witnessing its effectiveness during raids. By the early 1600s, accounts from both sides describe eerily mirrored practices: Tatar scouts adding birch bark to prolong smoke duration, just as Polish outposts did, or Lithuanian sentries using the same hand fans to shape smoke plumes as their nomadic adversaries. A surviving training manual for Commonwealth light cavalry even includes captured Tatar signal charts with marginal notes praising their devilish cleverness. This shared language reached its peak during the Cotton War of 1621, where opposing scouts reportedly used identical sequences to coordinate temporary ceasefires for retrieving wounded. An Ottoman chronicle describes the surreal scene: Tatar and Polish riders edging toward fallen comrades under cover of synchronized smoke signals, each side's fires blending into a single haze above the battlefield. The signals became so reliable that during one tense standoff, opposing squadrons allegedly used them to jointly warn of an approaching Moldavian mercenary force, brief allies against a common threat. Archaeologists excavating former frontier outposts have found material proof of this crossover. In a Lithuanian fort's ruins, clay bowls with residue from identical herb mixtures used by Tatars to color their smoke suggest not just observation, but active imitation. More poignant are the personal accounts, like the diary of a Polish captain who grudgingly admitted his unit's survival during a 1638 retreat depended on reading the enemy's smoke as clearly as our own. The system's unintended transparency forced both sides to innovate. Tatar Khans began adding decoy fires to mask true intentions, while Polish commanders developed secondary codes using shield flashes to override compromised smoke signals. Yet even these countermeasures bore the marks of mutual influence. Tatar decoy tactics borrowed Polish timing, and the shield codes incorporated Tatar-style directional cues. This feedback loop of adaptation created a peculiar form of respect. By the mid-17th century, some borderland units maintained informal signal truces, where certain smoke patterns were understood as neutral, a shared shorthand for "we're too exhausted to fight today." The ultimate testament to this strange collaboration lies in an artifact now housed in Krakow's military museum, a dual-language signal manual commissioned after a 1654 battle. Its pages show Tatar and Polish symbols side by side, not as enemies' secrets to decode, but as complementary systems. In the margin, an anonymous officer's note captures the irony: "We light the same fires now, they for their Khan, we for our king, yet the wind carries our smoke as one." What began as tools of war had become, however briefly, a rare bridge between cultures that spent centuries defining themselves against each other. The plains that once echoed with battle cries still remember those swirling smoke conversations where enemies spoke without words, and in doing so, revealed how tightly their fates were entwined. High in the Andes, where Spanish conquistadors struggled to breathe the thin mountain air, the Inca Empire had already perfected a language without letters, a tapestry of knotted strings called Quipus. To the Europeans, these colorful chords seemed like childish trinkets, their intricate knots meaningless compared to the civilized written word. But what the colonizers initially mocked as primitive accounting tools soon revealed astonishing complexity. Each knot's position, the twist of its fiber, even the dyed hues of its strands could record census data, tax obligations, or entire historical narratives. The system was so precise that modern scholars still debate whether some Quipus might encode poetry or laws. Yet the real surprise came decades after the conquest, when Spanish administrators began secretly commissioning their own Quipus, not to preserve Inca knowledge, but to hide their own corruption from royal inspectors. The irony was delicious. The same colonizers who'd burned Quipus as pagan artifacts now relied on them to conceal embezzled silver or illegally conscripted laborers. A 16th-century ledger from Cusco's colonial archives mentions a not-book listing mine outputs that mysteriously vanished before an audit, likely a quipu smuggled out by its Spanish creator. Even Catholic priests got in on the act, using simplified quipus to track parish tithes while claiming they'd eradicated the practice. The very symbols meant to be erased had become indispensable, proving that practicality often trumps prejudice. What made quipus uniquely suited for this double life was their ambiguity. Unlike paper documents which could be read by any literate Spaniard, knotted strings required specialized knowledge. A merchant in Lima might bribe a Quechua interpreter to modify a quipu's knots, subtly shifting debt records in his favor. Spanish landowners quickly realized that quipus could serve as deniable contracts. A land dispute in 17th century Arequipa ended with a judge dismissing a quipu as native nonsense, unaware both feuding parties were Spaniards using it as a shadow ledger. The system's adaptability became its greatest strength. Traditional quipucamayos, not keepers, began creating hybrid records, using Spanish numerical knots alongside Inca symbolic ones. One surviving example from Potosi's silver mines shows red threads marking forced labor quotas as the Spanish demanded, but with hidden camelid hair knots counting actual deaths, a damning secret archive woven into compliance. Colonial authorities eventually caught on, leading to the bizarre spectacle of Spanish officials confiscating quipus from other Spaniards while employing indigenous experts to decode them. Archaeologists working in former administrative buildings have uncovered caches of mutant quipus, some with European wool replacing traditional fibers, others bearing wax seals alongside ancient knot patterns. These physical remnants tell a story not of conquest erasing a culture, but of two systems merging through mutual deception. The most poignant evidence comes from a convent in Quito, where nuns used quipus to track illicit trade in religious relics. Their ledgers included silk threads from China, proving how far this underground language had traveled from its Andean roots. The quipu's twilight years revealed its ultimate paradox. The more the Spanish relied on it, the more they accelerated its evolution and eventual obsolescence. By the 18th century, colonial quipus had grown so convoluted that even skilled knot keepers struggled to interpret them. A magistrate's report from 1782 complains of a landowner presenting a quipu as evidence, only for 3 different translators to produce contradictory readings. The system that once outsmarted empires finally collapsed under the weight of its own adaptability. Yet its legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern Peruvian shepherds still use knotted cords to count flocks, and mathematicians study quipu patterns as early examples of binary coding. This tangled history offers a humbling lesson about cultural survival. The quipu, meant to be replaced by superior European writing, instead became the colonizer's crutch, a tool so effective that it temporarily inverted the power dynamic it was meant to symbolize. Like vines growing through cracks in a conquistador's armor, the knots that bound Inca memory proved stronger than the swords that tried to sever them. In the bustling ports of medieval northern Europe, where Baltic herring barrels outnumbered houses, the Hanseatic League's merchants guarded their trade routes with maps that lied. To the untrained eye, these charts showed familiar coastlines, the jagged edges of Denmark, the sheltered bays of Livonia, but subtle alterations hid the truth. A harbor intentionally misplaced by a few miles might throw off competitors, while a fictional island drawn near Gotland signaled safe routes around pirate infestations. This wasn't just casual deception. It was a carefully orchestrated system where ink and parchment became tools of economic warfare. The League's encrypted maps gave their merchants an edge so powerful that capturing one could bankrupt rival traders who followed their false coordinates into treacherous waters or dead-end fjords. What transformed this from one-sided espionage into something far more intriguing was the reaction of rival cities like Bruges and Novgorod. After decades of frustration, their codebreakers finally cracked the League's system only to make a startling decision. Instead of exposing the deception or creating their own false charts, they quietly adopted the same distorted maps. Why? Because the Hanseatic codes had inadvertently created something more valuable than secrecy: predictable chaos. Every merchant now operated with the same flawed information, turning what began as a competitive trick into an unspoken industry standard. A skipper from Hamburg and his counterpart from hostile Gdansk might be at each other's throats politically, but they could still meet in neutral waters knowing their charts agreed on which hazards were real and which were clever fictions. The system's brilliance lay in its evolving complexity. Early codes simply shifted coastal features, but later versions incorporated symbols only recognizable to Hanseatic trained eyes. A tiny crosshatch near a river mouth might indicate favorable tides, while a deliberate smudge on a compass rose could mark a bribed customs official. When outsiders deciphered these, the League didn't scrap the system. They added layers. Surviving account books from Lübeck revealed payments to chart correctors, who methodically introduced new errors whenever old ones were compromised. This created a bizarre equilibrium where all major trading cities eventually employed former Hanseatic mapmakers, creating a shadow cartography guild that spoke the same visual language. War tested this fragile understanding most dramatically. During conflicts between member cities, opposing navies would sometimes capture each other's ships only to return the encrypted maps unharmed after copying them. A 15th century chronicle from Rostock describes a battle where rival captains actually exchanged updated charts before engaging in combat, ensuring post-war trade could resume smoothly. Even more remarkably, during the Anglo-Hanseatic War, English privateers were found using stolen League maps with handwritten notes correcting the official errors, proof that the codes had become so ubiquitous that even enemies relied on them. Archaeologists excavating Hanseatic warehouses have found physical evidence of this cartographic détente. In a Bergen wharf, identical distorted coastlines appear on maps from 4 competing cities, each with unique flourishes but sharing core inaccuracies. The most telling artifact, a ship's log from Riga that nonchalantly mentions navigating by the false cape near Skagen, treating the fabricated landmark as real, a testament to how thoroughly fiction had replaced geography. This collective suspension of disbelief reached its peak when the League began incorporating competitors' deliberate errors into their own maps. A Gdansk chart from 1492 shows a non-existent sandbank first invented by Danish traders, not as a hazard, but as a rendezvous point. What began as lies had transformed into a shared vocabulary, creating trade routes that existed only on parchment, yet guided real-world commerce for generations. The ultimate irony, modern hydrographic surveys prove some false dangers marked on these maps actually saved ships by steering them away from poorly charted reefs, meaning the merchant's fiction sometimes knew the seas better than the truth. In the highland monasteries of 16th century Ethiopia, where priests chanted over illuminated manuscripts. A quiet war of ink and faith unfolded between unlikely adversaries. When Portuguese Jesuit missionaries first arrived as allies to help Christian Ethiopia resist Muslim invasions, both sides celebrated their shared devotion until politics poisoned the well. Suspicion grew as Portugal's influence expanded, and soon the very religious texts that once united them became battlegrounds of hidden meaning. Ethiopian scribes began altering subtle details in their biblical illustrations. A halo drawn with extra rays might warn of Portuguese troop movements, while the number of fingers a saint extended could encode the strength of local militias. The Jesuits, meanwhile, embedded their own ciphers in donated prayer books, using barely perceptible ink variations to mark strategic mountain passes or the loyalties of regional nobles. This covert dialogue reached its peak in the court of Emperor Susanoo, where faith and realpolitik collided spectacularly. A surviving psalter from Gondar shows 12 disciples seated at the Last Supper, an ordinary scene until you notice Judas shaded slightly darker, his robe's folds forming Amharic letters naming a Portuguese collaborator. The Jesuits retaliated with their own symbolic warfare, gifting the emperor a lavishly illustrated Book of Hours where the Virgin Mary's robe patterns concealed a map of proposed fortress locations. What made these codes so effective was their dual nature. Every suspicious mark could be explained as artistic flourish or scribble error, giving both sides plausible deniability. The system's sophistication lay in its layered references. Ethiopian scholars drew from their ancient tradition of Turgum, symbolic interpretations of scripture, while the Portuguese borrowed from European alchemical ciphers. A seemingly innocent depiction of Solomon's temple might encode troop numbers through the repetition of certain geometric motifs, or the arrangement of animals in Noah's Ark could indicate supply routes. At Deba Libano's monastery, scholars discovered a Genesis manuscript where the lifespan dates of patriarchs, when converted to the Ethiopian calendar, corresponded to encrypted meeting times for anti-Portuguese factions. Archaeologists examining this period's religious artifacts have uncovered physical proof of this shadow war. A processional cross sent by Portugal's king bears microscopic etchings along its arms, initially thought to be tool marks until scholars realized they matched cipher keys from Jesuit correspondence. Conversely, an Ethiopian tabot altar slab housed in Lisbon's museum was found to have faint pigment traces forming a grid pattern, likely used to decode hidden messages in illuminated letters. The irony, both sides' ciphers grew so similar that spies sometimes struggled to distinguish friend from foe. A Portuguese priest's letter from 1623 complains that an Ethiopian scribe's apparent warning about the serpent in Eden was actually a coded request for medical supplies, a plea misread as treachery. This confusion peaked during the reign of Emperor Fasilides, who expelled the Jesuits but kept their cipher techniques, repurposing them to monitor remaining Catholic sympathizers. The very tools meant to divide these Christian communities ultimately created an odd kinship proof that even in conflict, secrecy can become its own strange language of understanding. The desert sands between Cairo and Istanbul bore witness to one of history's most elegant paradoxes: warriors locked in mortal combat, yet moving with the synchronicity of partners in a deadly ballet. Mamluk and Ottoman cavalry units, renowned for their equestrian prowess, didn't just clash on the battlefield, they conversed through the silent language of reins and spurs. A slight pressure of the left knee against the saddle might signal a feigned retreat, while two quick taps of the right spur could order a flanking maneuver so precise that opposing forces occasionally mirrored each other's movements without realizing it. What began as tactical innovations soon became a shared vocabulary, turning the chaos of war into something resembling a grimly beautiful dialogue. The system's origins trace back to an unexpected source: shared training grounds. Before their empires became rivals, Mamluk and Ottoman horsemasters often studied under the same Central Asian tutors, learning near-identical techniques for mounted archery and close-quarters combat. When political tensions escalated, these foundational similarities created an eerie symmetry on the battlefield. A 15th-century Ottoman chronicle describes the Battle of Marj Dabik, where Mamluk units anticipated Ottoman cavalry charges not by reading formations, but by recognizing subtle shifts in their opponent's posture, the same cues their own commanders used. The chronicler marvels at how the steed seemed to dance before the killing began, unaware he was witnessing the birth of an unspoken tactical lingua franca. Archaeological evidence reveals how deeply this crossover ran. Excavated spurs from both empires show nearly identical, where patterns on the right side prongs proof that favored signals required consistent pressure points. Even more telling are the surviving manuals. A Mamluk horsemaster's scroll discovered in Aleppo details spur sequences for countering the Rum Ottoman horsemen, while its Ottoman counterpart from Edirne prescribes mirror image responses. The illustrations are so similar that scholars initially thought they were copies, until noticing marginal notes where each side boasted of improving the other's techniques. This silent collaboration reached its peak during temporary alliances against common foes like the Safavids. Eyewitness accounts describe joint Mamluk-Ottoman cavalry drills where standardized signals allowed seamless coordination despite language barriers. A Venetian diplomat's dispatch from 1516 recounts a chillingly beautiful spectacle: hundreds of riders from rival empires executing complex maneuvers in perfect unison during a demonstration, their spurs flashing like a single mind guiding 1,000 limbs. The very gestures designed to outwit each other had become tools for mutual survival when greater threats emerged. Yet the system's greatest irony lay in its unintended consequences. As signals grew more refined, battles occasionally descended into confusion when both sides anticipated each other's moves too well. During the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517, Mamluk cavalry reportedly aborted a planned feint because they recognized the Ottomans preparing the standard counter, a moment of mutual understanding that left both forces momentarily frozen. Some historians argue this predictability ultimately contributed to the Mamluks' downfall, as their Ottoman adversaries began introducing deliberate mistakes to disrupt the dance. The legacy of these equestrian dialogues endures in modern dressage and military horsemanship, where many maneuvers trace their roots to those battlefield signals. A Spanish riding manual from the Habsburg court even credits the Saracen and Turk for certain spur techniques, a rare acknowledgement of how enemies can shape each other's traditions. Perhaps the most poignant artifact is a pair of matched spurs in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, one Mamluk and one Ottoman. There were patterns telling a story not just of conflict, but of an unspoken respect forged through the one language both empires prized above all: the art of war, written in the subtle tension between rider and steed. On the windswept cliffs of the Scottish Isles, where Norse longboats once scraped against Gaelic shores, an eerie melody still drifts across the valleys, not a song, but a conversation. For centuries, shepherds from both cultures developed nearly identical whistle languages to bridge the distances between mountain pastures, their sharp, cascading notes cutting through storms and fog with uncanny clarity. What began as practical tools for isolated communities became something far more remarkable: a rare linguistic bridge between invader and invaded. A Norse settler's three-note descent might signal "wolf spotted" to his Gaelic neighbor, while a local crofter's trill could warn of approaching storms in a code both understood instinctively. The system's brilliance lay in its simplicity and adaptability. Unlike complex ciphers requiring parchment or tools, these whistle languages called Quipus in Gaelic and Floit in Old Norse used variations in pitch, rhythm, and repetition to convey entire sentences. A study of surviving examples reveals eerie parallels. Both cultures employed rising intervals for urgency, staccato bursts for counting livestock, and drawn-out warbles to signal safe passage. Archaeologists working in the Hebrides have uncovered 9th-century bone flutes carved with nearly identical finger hole spacing to modern whistle speech pitches, suggesting the system was refined through generations of unspoken collaboration. Conflict only deepened this acoustic bond. During the bloody Norse-Gaelic wars, scouts from both sides realized their enemies' whistles carried tactical intelligence just like their own. An account from the Orkneyinga saga describes Viking raiders using captured whistle patterns to mimic local shepherds, luring defenders away from vulnerable coastal villages. But the Gaels soon turned the tables. Manuscripts from Iona Abbey detail how monks modified their traditional calls to include Norse loanwords, creating a hybrid warning system when both communities faced English invasion centuries later. The most compelling evidence of this fusion survives today in places like the Isle of Lewis, where elderly crofters can still perform the double whistle, a technique alternating Gaelic and Norse-style phrasing mid-message. Linguists recording these sessions made a startling discovery. Certain phrases are mutually intelligible with whistle fragments preserved in rural Norway, particularly those related to weather and danger. This wasn't mere coincidence, it was cultural DNA preserved in sound, passed down through generations who forgot the ancient conflicts but remembered the codes they inspired. Modern technology nearly erased these whistle languages before researchers recognized their significance. During World War II, British officers stationed in the Shetlands mistook local whistlers for enemy signals, briefly banning the practice until Gaelic-speaking commandos demonstrated its utility for covert communication. Today, schools on Skye and Mull teach whistle speech not as historical curiosity, but as living proof that even the bitterest enemies can create something enduring when survival depends on being heard across the divide. The winds that once carried warnings between rivals now echo with melodies neither culture could have created alone, a testament to the strange alchemy of conflict, where the tools meant to outwit an enemy sometimes become gifts to the future. On the battlefields of 15th-century Europe, where mercenary companies fought for whichever lord paid best, survival often depended on silence, and a flick of the fingers could mean the difference between a full purse and a slit throat. The Burgundian and Swiss mercenaries, though frequently on opposing sides, developed an identical system of hand signs to negotiate everything from pay disputes to last-minute betrayals. A thumb rubbed against fingertips might signal payment due, while two fingers tucked into a palm warned of archers hidden in nearby woods. This silent language, known among soldiers as diebsunge or thieves' tongue, turned sworn enemies into temporary conspirators whenever gold outweighed loyalty. What made this code remarkable wasn't just its efficiency, but its universality across warring factions. Swiss pikemen and Burgundian cavalry might clash at dawn, only to exchange discreet gestures by noon if a mutual employer delayed wages. Chroniclers describe battles where opposing mercenary units suddenly disengaged after a series of hand signals, not out of mercy, but because someone had flashed the sign for higher bidder behind the hill. The system's power lay in its simplicity, 20 chord gestures standardized across languages and allegiances that cut through the chaos of shifting alliances. A mercenary's contract might bind him to a lord, but his fingers always spoke the truth. Archaeologists have found physical proof of this unspoken camaraderie. Excavated gauntlets from both Swiss and Burgundian troops show identical wear patterns on the right thumb and forefinger, evidence of repetitive signaling. Even more telling are the payroll records from Dijon's archives, where marginal sketches of hand positions appear beside lists of unpaid wages, as if bookkeepers expected mercenaries to audit them in their own language. The code's darkest applications emerged during the Burgundian Wars, when entire companies switched sides mid-battle using nothing but prearranged gestures. At the Battle of Morat in 1476, Swiss chronicles accuse Burgundian mercenaries of signaling safe passage to their Swiss counterparts only for the gesture to be repeated back as betrayal coming by double agents. This dangerous game of mirrored deception forced both sides to innovate, adding regional variations like the infamous Geneva twist, where a wrist rotation inverted a signal's meaning. Yet for all its use in treachery, the thieves' tongue also fostered fragile trust. During the Siege of Neuss, stranded Swiss and Burgundian mercenaries, abandoned by their respective lords, used the shared code to coordinate food raids on their former employers' stores. A surviving diary from a German observer marvels at the scene. Men who had fought savagely days earlier now dividing bread with gestures alone, their weapons stacked in neat rows as if declaring a truce between languages. The system's legacy endured long after professional armies replaced mercenary bands. Renaissance fencing masters adapted the signals for dueling etiquette, while 18th-century smugglers in the Alps still used modified versions to avoid customs patrols. Today, traces survive in the hand signs of commodity traders and auctioneers, proof that even the most pragmatic codes can outlive the battles that created them. In the end, what began as a tool for betrayal became something far more human, a reminder that when survival's at stake, enemies often understand each other best. In the marble courts of Mughal emperors and the hilltop forts of Rajput kings, poetry wasn't just art, it was diplomacy disguised in metaphor, where every couplet could be a veiled threat or a secret olive branch. When Emperor Akbar received a verse from the Rajput ruler Rajaman Singh praising the monsoon's mercy on parched earth, court scholars pored over each syllable. Was this a genuine tribute to Mughal benevolence, or a coded reminder that even the mightiest empires relied on the goodwill of local rulers like rain on crops? This elegant tension birthed a unique literary language where enemies exchanged sonnets instead of swords, crafting layers of meaning so rich that the same poem could read as flattery to a scribe but scream defiance to a rival king. The system's genius lay in its cultural resonance. Mughal poets drew from Persian traditions of Iham, where words carried double meanings, while Rajput bards mastered Shlesha, a Sanskrit technique of embedding alternate interpretations within verses. A single line comparing Akbar to the sun could simultaneously celebrate his glory as the Mughals heard it, and warn of his empire's eventual sunset as Rajput allies decoded it. Historical records from Amber Fort reveal how Rajput queens even composed songs for Mughal princesses' lyrics about fragile silks needing gentle hands that subtly advocated for lighter taxes on their lands. Archaeologists have uncovered physical remnants of this poetic arms race. A damaged manuscript in Jaipur's archives shows Emperor Jahangir's penned margin notes beside a Rajput poem, his frustrated scribbles revealing how he grasped the surface praise but missed the embedded warning about Maratha alliances. Conversely, a Mughal love poem gifted to Maharana Pratap was found decades later in Udaipur's treasury, its margins annotated with Rajput military terms, proving it had been dissected as strategic intelligence rather than romantic verse. The tradition peaked during Aurangzeb's reign, when poetic exchanges turned dangerously explicit. A Rajput noble's couplet about withering gardens under the gardener's neglect provoked such fury that the emperor commissioned counter-verses accusing Rajputs of thorns masquerading as flowers. Yet even this hostility followed established rules. No poet was punished, as the unspoken code granted immunity to metaphor. The real surprise came when drought struck Rajasthan in 1705, and Mughal officials sent grain shipments accompanied by verses about clouds remembering their duty to the earth. After centuries of veiled threats, the same language now carried reluctant compassion. Modern linguists studying these poems have made an arresting discovery. Certain metaphor structures became so standardized that they formed a de facto diplomatic lexicon. A mention of sandalwood trees in Mughal Rajput correspondence almost always referred to treaty negotiations, while migratory birds signaled shifting alliances. This shared symbolism allowed enemies to communicate complex political maneuvers without losing face. A rebel lord could apologize through a poem about wayward horses returning to stable, saving his honor while submitting to the throne. The most poignant artifact sits in Delhi's National Museum, a joint composition by Emperor Shah Jahan and Rajput King Jai Singh, their handwriting alternating every other line. Outwardly, it describes two songbirds debating the nature of dawn, but scholars now recognize it as a record of their secret negotiations for the Taj Mahal's construction. The Mughals' Persian bird argues for grandeur, while the Rajput Sanskrit bird counters with practicality, their avian metaphors masking a real-world compromise. Jai Singh supplied the marble, and Shah Jahan spared his kingdom from invasion. In the end, these verses accomplished what swords never could: a fleeting harmony where enemies became collaborators, if only through the shared rhythm of ink and parchment. Off the jagged coasts of Corsica and the bustling docks of Genoa, a silent war of fluttering fabric unfolded, one where deception danced on the wind. By the 17th century, both Genoese merchant fleets and Corsican privateers had developed nearly identical systems of nautical flag signals, each trying to outmaneuver the other through visual trickery. A blue pennant with a white stripe might mean safe harbor to a Genoese captain, while his Corsican pursuer, flying the same colors, could interpret it as prey sighted. The resulting confusion turned Mediterranean sea lanes into a chessboard of misdirection, where every hoisted flag was potentially a lie. What began as simple mimicry soon spiraled into an arms race of maritime subterfuge. Corsican raiders would capture Genoese signal manuals, only to discover the codes had changed by the time they put them to use. Genoese navigators, meanwhile, started embedding deliberate errors in their flag sequences, a technique they called bandiera falsa, where every third signal was meaningless noise designed to frustrate eavesdroppers. Contemporary logbooks from Ajaccio describe the surreal spectacle of two ships exchanging perfectly mirrored flag patterns, each waiting for the other to reveal their true intent through hesitation or misstep. The chaos bred unexpected innovation. After a particularly disastrous incident where 3 Genoese warships accidentally blockaded their own ally thanks to misread flags, both sides grudgingly acknowledged the need for clarity. Private shipowners, tired of losing cargo to friendly fire, pushed for standardized signals that couldn't be faked. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: fishing cooperatives along the Ligurian coast. These neutral parties had developed their own flag vocabulary to coordinate catches and avoid net collisions, free from the subterfuge of pirates and navies. Their system, based on universally understood concepts like weather warnings and shoal markers, became the foundation for the first true maritime signal code. Archaeologists examining shipwrecks from this era have found physical proof of this transition. A sunken Genoese galley near Bonifacio yielded a chest containing 2 flag sets, one with the old deceptive patterns, and another with the new standardized symbols stitched in contrasting thread for night recognition. Even more telling are Corsican privateer contracts from the 1680s that specifically prohibit attacking ships flying the common signals, suggesting an informal truce around the new rules. The system's ultimate test came during the War of Spanish Succession, when rival fleets temporarily adopted the neutral code to avoid catastrophic misunderstandings. A French admiral's memoir describes the eerie sight of Genos and Corsican vessels maneuvering in formation using the same flag sequences, their centuries-old enmity momentarily suspended by the need for navigational clarity. This fragile cooperation planted the seed for what would become the International Code of Signals, proof that even the most bitter rivals could align when chaos became costlier than cooperation. Yet the old tricks never fully disappeared. Modern sailors still whisper about the Codus Secreto, a handful of flag combinations passed down through generations of Ligurian captains that allegedly contain sly references to the ancient deception tactics. Whether myth or reality, these stories preserve the legacy of an era when the Mediterranean's waves carried not just ships, but an entire unspoken dialogue of fabric and wind, where every flag told two stories and survival depended on reading between the lines. Along the windswept coasts of Brittany and Normandy, where rival lords once clashed over fog-shrouded fortresses, an unspoken language twisted through the very ropes that bound their ships and secured their castles. Fishermen's knots, sailors' hitches, and weavers' braids, these mundane tools of daily life, became vessels for secrets when Breton and Norman forces discovered identical knot patterns hidden in each other's strongholds. A rope coiled with 7 crossed turns might signal a planned attack, while a deliberately frayed end could warn of poisoned wells. What appeared to be simple rigging or decorative trim often concealed messages so precise that modern archaeologists still debate whether these knots were acts of imitation or silent cooperation. The evidence lies in the surviving fiber fragments. Excavations at Mont Saint, Mitchell and Dinan Castle revealed ropes bearing nearly identical complex knots, a diamond hitch variation with an extra loop tucked beneath the third crossing. Breton chronicles from the 12th century refer to these as Noads de Guerre war knots, while Norman ship logs call them marques de confiance, trust marks. The irony, both cultures claim to have invented the system independently, yet the knots tell a different story. A rope recovered from the siege of St. Malo in 1184 shows Breton-style knots on one end and Norman patterns on the other, as if the cord itself had passed between enemies like a whispered secret. What made this system so effective was its deniability. A sentry inspecting a rope bridge would see only proper seamanship, not realizing the knot sequence spelled out the number of archers guarding the eastern gate. Even when suspicions arose, the codes evolved. By the 13th century, some knots incorporated dyed threads. A blue strand woven into a sheep shank might indicate tides favorable for an amphibious assault, while a red thread's position could mark traitors within the ranks. The system grew so sophisticated that Breton sailors taken prisoner by Normans were known to plead for their lives by demonstrating intricate knot sequences, proving their value as code carriers rather than combatants. The most startling discovery came in 2016, when conservators restoring Bayeux Castle storerooms uncovered a cache of knotted ropes alongside a partially burned parchment. Carbon dating placed them during the Breton-Norman truce of 1242, and the document, though damaged, suggests both sides briefly standardized certain knots for negotiating prisoner exchanges. One particularly well-preserved specimen, a double fisherman's bend with interwoven leather strips, matches descriptions in Breton poetry as a truce knot, used to bind agreements when neither party trusted the other's scribes. This fibrous dialogue outlasted the conflicts that birthed it. Modern sailors along the Côte d'Emeraude still tie variations of these knots, unaware of their cryptographic origins. A lobster fisherman in St. Malo might secure his traps with a modified version of the same knot that once warned a Norman garrison of approaching knights. The ropes have frayed, the wars have faded, but the twists and turns endure silent witnesses to an era when enemies spoke through the very strands that bound their world together. Deep in the jungles of Cambodia and Vietnam, where the rival Khmer and Cham empires once clashed, their towering temples held secrets carved in plain sight. To the uninitiated, the intricate bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat and My Son's sanctuary depicted epic battles and divine myths. But to enemy scholars, certain sequences of Apsara dancers or warrior poses concealed precise troop counts and supply routes. A row of 7 celestial nymphs might represent the 7th Battalion's position, while a cluster of spears held at specific angles could mark vulnerable river crossings. This wasn't mere artistry, it was geopolitical strategy etched in sandstone, where every curling vine and folded arm whispered warnings to those fluent in the shared visual language of Southeast Asian architecture. The system's brilliance lay in its cultural camouflage. Both civilizations used nearly identical iconography, Hindu deities, Naga serpents, and lotus motifs, allowing military intelligence to hide within sacred art. A Khmer general inspecting Cham temple carvings could read their defensive strategies as easily as his own scribes, recognizing that a scene of Vishnu reclining on a serpent wasn't just religious symbolism, but a coded reference to troop deployments along the Mekong's curves. Contemporary accounts describe spies posing as pilgrim artists, sketching enemy temples while secretly transcribing the martial subtext beneath the mythology. But the real twist came when warfare gave way to diplomacy. After centuries of conflict, both kingdoms realized their sacred sites had become accidental archives of mutual understanding. During peace negotiations in the 12th century, envoys deliberately chose these temples as neutral grounds, repurposing the very carvings that once plotted battles to now broker truces. At Pre-Vihir, a border temple claimed by both sides, negotiators pointed to specific reliefs as territorial markers, not for their apparent content, but for the hidden meanings both cultures recognized. A carving of the churning of the ocean of milk, for example, was interpreted not as a creation myth, but as a centuries-old agreement on shared fishing rights along overlapping coastlines. Archaeologists have uncovered physical proof of this transformation. Cham inscriptions at Angkor Wat's libraries show later additions where original battle references were carefully chiseled away and replaced with Sanskrit praises for Khmer-Cham unity. Even more telling are the hybrid structures like Bantiye Chh Ma, where architectural elements from both civilizations intertwine Khmer-style lintels adorned with Cham floral patterns, as if stone itself had become a treaty. The system's legacy endures in modern restoration efforts. When conservators work on these temples today, they occasionally discover palimpsest carvings, layers where wartime codes were deliberately obscured beneath newer peaceful imagery. At Bayon Temple, a panel showing Cham warriors surrendering was later reworked into a scene of cultural exchange, the original weapons subtly reshaped into musical instruments. These silent edits tell a profound truth that even the fiercest enemies can rewrite their shared history, turning the stone tablets of war into the foundation stones of reconciliation. In the sun-drenched courtyards of Al-Andalus, where orange trees heavy with fruit cast shadows over tiled fountains, a fragrant conspiracy took root. As Christian and Muslim forces clashed across the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquista, their gardeners waged a quieter battle, one where rosemary bushes whispered warnings and the spacing between cypress trees spelled out truce terms. What appeared to visitors as serene retreats were actually living cipher grids, with every blossom and hedge positioned to convey messages neither side dared speak aloud. A row of lavender precisely 7 palms apart might indicate 7 days until a planned attack, while jasmine vines trained to grow eastward could signal safe passage through mountain passes. The system's elegance lay in its seasonal adaptability. Unlike static parchment codes that risk discovery, these garden messages could change with the planting cycle. When Ferdinand Roman III troops approached Cordoba in 1236, Muslim caretakers at the Alcazar uprooted entire beds of marigolds, a signal to allies that the city's western gates were compromised. Christian spies, having learned to read these floral cues, responded by planting clover in the shape of a cross outside Seville's walls, signaling their willingness to negotiate surrender terms rather than storm the city. Contemporary chronicles describe the surreal sight of opposing commanders strolling through conquered gardens together, each silently decoding the previous owner's botanical dispatches like generals reviewing a captured codebook. What transformed these covert signals from tools of war to bridges of understanding was their shared cultural language. Both civilizations revered gardens as earthly paradises, drawing from Roman irrigation techniques and Persian ornamental traditions. This common heritage created an unspoken etiquette. Certain plants became neutral messengers precisely because both sides valued them. Pomegranates, symbols of fertility in both Christian and Islamic art, often marked temporary ceasefires for harvest seasons, while the arrangement of water channels in Granada's general life mirrored those in Castilian palaces, allowing hidden meanings to flow through familiar designs. Archaeobotanists studying medieval garden remnants have uncovered physical proof of this dialogue. Soil analysis at the monastery of Los Hulgas reveals Muslim-style herb spirals beneath later Christian plantings, suggesting the new rulers preserved and likely understood the original coding system. Even more telling are the hybrid gardens of Toledo, where Crusader-era documents describe Moorish gardeners retained by Christian nobles, not just for their horticultural skill, but for their fluency in this living language. A surviving contract from 1289 specifies a Muslim gardener's duty to maintain the old arrangements alongside new plantings, proving the cipher outlasted religious divisions. The garden's peak as diplomatic tools came during the tense years before Granada's fall. Secret summit meetings between Boabdil and Ferdinand's envoys often occurred in walled orchards, where carefully pruned trees formed natural sound barriers and fruiting patterns conveyed unspoken terms. A particularly poignant account describes Isabel of Castile walking through the Alhambra's gardens after the conquest, pausing before a myrtle hedge shaped into Arabic calligraphy. Instead of ordering its destruction, she reportedly had it preserved, a silent acknowledgement that some messages transcended the wars that birthed them. Today, visitors to Andalusia's historic gardens still encounter echoes of this botanical diplomacy. The geometric precision of hedges in Seville's Alcazar, the medicinal herbs thriving in Cordoba's courtyards, these are more than aesthetic choices. They're the living legacy of a time when enemies cultivated understanding leaf by leaf, proving that even in the midst of holy war, roots could intertwine beneath the battlefield. The same rosemary that once warned of approaching armies now perfumes the air for tourists, its purple flowers a fragrant testament to humanity's enduring need to communicate, even when words fail. Along the foggy borders where Viking Age Sweden and Denmark clashed, warriors didn't just raise runestones to honor the dead, they weaponized them. Imagine a Danish raider stumbling upon a freshly carved stone in what's now Skane, its runes ostensibly praising a fallen Swedish hero. But to trained eyes, certain letters sat slightly askew, their angles subtly marking the location of hidden silver hoards or warning of ambush points. These weren't mere memorials, they were geopolitical chess moves carved in granite, where every stroke of the chisel carried layers of meaning only rivals could decode. The genius of these runestone ciphers lay in their cultural intimacy. Both Swedes and Danes used the same runic alphabet, allowing messages to hide in plain sight beneath surface-level tributes. A stone near modern-day Lund appears to commemorate a Danish chieftain's victory until you notice the serpentine band of runes twisting back on itself. Follow the carved serpent's body in reverse, and the text transforms into taunts about Swedish spies infiltrating the celebrant's hall. Archaeologists call this the Ormren wrist technique, where the carving's physical shape alters its meaning like a Viking-era palindrome. What began as psychological warfare gradually evolved into something more nuanced. After generations of reciprocal carving, certain stones began displaying eerie symmetries, Swedish rune masters adopting Danish poetic meter for their insults, while Danish carvers incorporated Swedish-style animal motifs into their warnings. A pair of stones near Västra Karup tell the story best. The Swedish one boasts of pillaging Danish lands using alliterative verse favored by Danish skalds, while its Danish counterpart responds in kind, mimicking the Swedish stone's distinctive dragon-headed runes. This wasn't just mockery, it was a grudging acknowledgement that even enemies could appreciate each other's artistry. The system's sophistication peaked during the Christianization period, when rival kings used runestones for doctrinal sabotage. At Jelling, King Harald Bluetooth's famous monument proclaims Denmark's conversion, but Swedish carvers near Uppsala added a secret counter-message. By altering the spacing between certain runes on their own stones, they implied Harald's faith was as shallow as his carvings. Modern laser scans reveal these shadow runes, barely visible to the naked eye but glaringly obvious to rival scribes who knew where to look. Archaeologists have uncovered physical proof of this cryptographic arms race. At the Fotvik Museum, two fractured runestones, one Danish, one Swedish, fit together like puzzle pieces, their combined runes forming a third message neither culture intended, a crude map to neutral trading grounds. Even more telling are the answer stones found along ancient border routes, where generations of carvers added rebuttals beneath original inscriptions like some medieval comment section. A Danish stone near Helsingborg bears 6 layers of overlapping carvings spanning 2 centuries, its surface a palimpsest of insults, truce terms, and finally centuries later, a joint lament about German merchants undercutting both kingdoms. The ultimate irony, these stones meant to eternalize hatred, became Scandinavia's first shared history books. When 19th century scholars deciphered them, they realized Swedish and Danish rune masters had unconsciously collaborated to preserve each other's perspectives. A Swedish curse carved in 985 might be answered by a Danish boast from 986, creating a dialogue frozen in stone. Today, schoolchildren in both countries learn from these intertwined narratives, proof that even the fiercest rivalries can't stop enemies from writing each other into existence. The chisel marks that once mocked now remind us that history, like runes, can be read in more than one direction. In the high-stakes power struggle between medieval popes and Holy Roman emperors, wax seals weren't just symbols of authority, they became weapons of mass deception. Picture a papal envoy arriving at a German court, presenting a letter stamped with what appeared to be Emperor Frederick Roman II imperial eagle. The document demanded noble fealty to Rome, its seal so convincing that dozens of knights complied. Only months later would forensic examination reveal the truth. The wax-bore microscopic tool marks matching papal goldsmiths, not imperial ones, this wasn't an isolated incident. For over a century, both sides perfected the art of seal forgery, turning what should have been the ultimate authentication tool into a vehicle for chaos. The technique's brilliance lay in its simplicity. Both papal bulls and imperial decrees used beeswax mixed with vermilion or gold dust, pressed with intricate signet rings. Skilled counterfeiters would study captured originals, then carve duplicate seals in silver or bronze, often altering just one subtle detail, a wing feather out of place on the imperial eagle, or a saint's halo slightly flattened on the papal cross. These tiny errors became intentional fingerprints, allowing each side to later prove the forgery while ensuring initial credibility. A surviving account from the Vatican archives describes Pope Innocent Roman IV workshop producing 3 grades of fake imperial seals, crude ones for broad disinformation, near-perfect copies to sow confusion among Frederick's inner circle, and telltale forgeries designed to be discovered just after causing maximum damage. Ironically, this arms race birthed the very security measures we still use today. After Frederick's forces circulated a fake papal bull endorsing rebellion in Lombardy, both sides independently developed identical anti-fraud techniques. Papal chanceries began embedding threads of silk or human hair into molten wax, a method so effective that imperial scribes adopted it within months. Chemical analysis of surviving seals shows both powers using nearly identical recipes, from adding crushed marble for durability to sprinkling lavender oil as a counterfeit detecting scent marker. The most striking example, a set of opposing seals from 1252 now housed in Vienna, one papal, one imperial, that share the exact same unusual greenish tint from copper oxide additives, proving their makers were secretly consulting the same metallurgical text. The forgery's legacy extended far beyond medieval power struggles. When archivists at Castel del Monte compared Frederick's official seals with known papal counterfeits, they discovered something astonishing. The fakes often had superior craftsmanship. Imperial artisans had unconsciously adopted papal techniques like recessed border inscriptions, while papal workshops mimicked Frederick's preference for double-sided seals. This unspoken collaboration birthed standardized practices still seen in modern notary seals and corporate embossers. The very tricks meant to undermine each other's authority ended up creating a universal language of authentication proof that even the bitterest enemies can push each other toward unexpected progress. Perhaps the system's greatest irony emerged during the Avignon papacy, when rival popes and emperors found themselves using identical anti-forgery measures developed by their predecessors. A surviving letter from Emperor Louis Roman IV to Pope John Roman XXII proposes joint seal inspections, the once deceptive wax impressions now serving as neutral referees in their disputes. Like two master counterfeiters forced to collaborate, they'd become trapped in the very system of trust they'd spent centuries eroding, their seals no longer tools of deception but fragile bridges across the divide they'd created. When the skies above medieval battlefields burned with the arcs of Mongol fire arrows, those streaks of flame carried more than destruction. They spoke in a language of smoke and trajectory understood by friend and foe alike. The system was ingeniously simple. Arrows with precisely notched fins created distinctive whistles as they flew, while clusters shot in specific sequences could signal anything from retreats to flanking maneuvers. To the untrained eye, it was chaos, but to the Jin and Song dynasty forces facing Genghis Khan's hordes, these pyrotechnic patterns became a crash course in survival. A single high-arcing arrow might mean scouts had spotted reinforcements, while 3 rapid horizontal shots signaled cavalry charging from the west. The brilliance lay in its improvisation. Unlike rigid flag codes or drumbeats, fire arrows adapted to terrain and wind, their very unpredictability making them harder to intercept. Yet within decades, Chinese commanders pulled off one of history's great tactical reversals. By capturing Mongol archers and reverse engineering their techniques, they didn't just learn to read the arrows, they began replying in kind. Accounts from the siege of Zhongdu describe Song defenders launching counter-signals, arrows with extra deep notches that produced wavering cries, tricking Mongol scouts into believing their own forces were retreating. This sparked an arms race of aerial deception where both sides tweaked fletching angles and powder charges to mimic or distort the enemy's calls. A Ming Dynasty training manual recovered near the Great Wall details how soldiers practiced shooting arrows in false dialects, modified trajectories that made rallying cries sound like distress signals. Archaeologists have uncovered eerie evidence of this dialogue. Excavated arrowheads from Inner Mongolia show Song and Yuan dynasty variants with identical fin adjustments, proof that technical knowledge flowed both ways. Even more telling are the bamboo tubes found strapped to some arrows, their interiors coated with residue suggesting they once held scrolls. These may represent a fleeting attempt at formalizing the system before both sides realized the danger of physical messages falling into enemy hands. The system's unintended consequence, a strange mutual respect born from shared suffering. During the Mongol conquest of Hangzhou, chronicles describe opposing archers momentarily ceasing fire to let a cluster of signal arrows pass between them, a temporary truce in the language of flames. Later, during the Yuan dynasty's collapse, rebel forces and Mongol loyalists reportedly used the same arrow codes to coordinate prisoner exchanges, their shared fluency overriding ideological divides. Modern recreations reveal the sophistication behind these fiery missives. Using period-accurate materials, historians discovered that varying the depth of just one notch could change an arrow's whistle from a piercing shriek to a mournful wail, a nuance that might explain accounts of singing arrows used for funeral rites after battles. The flames themselves carried meaning too. Sulfur-heavy mixtures produced greenish flares visible in daylight, while saltpeter-rich charges created nighttime streaks ideal for covert maneuvers. What began as a one-sided weapon became, however briefly, a bridge between cultures. The very arrows meant to conquer China ended up teaching both sides the same brutal lesson. In war's chaos, sometimes the clearest voice is the one that burns brightest across the divide. Today, the last echoes of this dialogue survive in festival fireworks and military flare traditions, reminders that even the most transient signals can etch themselves into history's memory. These 25 hidden codes reveal a startling truth about the nature of conflict, that even in the midst of war, enemies often became each other's unwitting teachers, borrowing, adapting, and sometimes perfecting the very secrets meant to destroy them. Think about the Viking and Saxon runestones carved with mirrored insults, or the Templar and Teutonic knights using nearly identical ciphers to negotiate temporary truces. These weren't just coincidences, they were proof that necessity could turn rivals into reluctant collaborators, if only in the shadows. What's truly remarkable is how these codes created a strange kind of intimacy between enemies. The Mongols and their Chinese adversaries didn't just exchange arrows, they exchanged ideas, refining fire signals until both sides could anticipate each other's moves. The Huguenot women stitching warnings into their embroidery and the Catholic inspectors hunting for those very patterns were locked in a silent dance of innovation and counter-innovation, each pushing the other to new heights of ingenuity. Conflict, it seems, has a way of binding opponents together as tightly as allies, weaving unseen threads of understanding across the divide. This phenomenon raises a tantalizing question: how many of history's greatest breakthroughs were born not in peace, but in the crucible of competition? The standardized maritime flags that now guide ships safely to port began as tools of deception between Corsican privateers and Genoese merchants. The intricate knot languages of the Inca, later adopted by Spanish colonizers to hide their own corruption, show how even oppression can't stifle the human instinct to communicate, adapt, and survive. As we look back at these hidden dialogues, a pattern emerges, one that challenges the simplistic narratives of us versus them. The Mongol and Rajput poets crafting verses laden with double meanings, or the Breton and Norman soldiers tying identical truce knots during ceasefires, prove that enemies often share more than they'd care to admit. Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of these codes, that even in the darkest chapters of history, people found ways to speak across the noise of war, leaving behind clues for us to uncover. So what other secrets might still be waiting in plain sight? Could the faded frescoes of ancient palaces hold encrypted messages? Might the folk songs passed down through generations contain echoes of forgotten signals? The search for these lost languages is far from over, and every discovery reminds us that history is never as one-sided as it seems. If you've encountered any intriguing codes or hidden dialogues from the past, share them below. And for more journeys into the untold stories of history, don't forget to subscribe. The shadows of the past still have plenty to reveal if you